Well, good evening, everybody. Hello, and welcome to the Montessori Museum of Science. My name is Marco Staffney, and we're glad to have you here for this evening's talk related to our visiting exhibition, Human Plus, Real Lives Plus Real Engineers. The exhibition tells compelling stories of engineers and users who design and use technologies to help themselves and others achieve their goals, from everyday routines to lifelong dreams. This evening's conversation focuses on the plus part of the Human Plus exhibition, or more precisely, how we as humans have added to or changed our bodies through the use of implants. One new solution to limb loss that the Human Plus exhibition displays is the modular prosthetic limb. That's what's pictured up there. This hand is controlled by a user's thoughts. Electrodes implanted in the brain detect brain signals and send them to a computer. The computer converts the brain signals into commands to move the hand. Now, a tiny chip that controls these movements is called the Utah electrode array. On the chip are 100 hair-like electrodes that are so sensitive they can detect the signals of individual nerve cells. Wires from the chip conduct brain signals to a connector mounted in the skull, which sends the signals to a computer. So having a device implanted in your brain might sound like science fiction, but it's been happening for some time. Brain or cerebral shunts are small devices used to treat hydrocephalus, or the swelling of the brain. And if adding technology to your brain sounds disheartening, think about all of the people, the millions of people, who have devices implanted into their hearts called pacemakers. How many people have fillings in their teeth? All right, so many of us have implants. We've been implanting all manners of technology into our bodies. And as we live longer, sometimes the human body can't keep up with our active lifestyle. Through medical innovations, we're able to maintain our body's processes or even replace parts of our bodies like hips, knees, or other joints. In the Monshires exhibition, Looking Inside, we present artificial joints. Total joint replacement is a treatment for many joint diseases, injuries, or age. As you can imagine, it's a lot riskier to change something on the inside of your body than on the outside. And the process takes a team of scientific collaborators. So luckily we have someone who is himself his own collaborator. With us today to discuss innovations in implants is Dr. Michael Mayer. Dr. Mayer is the William N. and Bessie Allen Professor Emeritus of Surgery and Orthopedics at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth, Emeritus Professor of Orthopedic Surgery at the Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, and co-founder of the Dartmouth Biomedical Engineering Center. Clearly he knows what he's talking about. He received his BEE from Yale's Sheffield School of Engineering and his MD degree from Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Mayer is not only an innovator in the field of implants, he is also a user. Adaptive technologies are a big part of his life, but I'll let him tell you more about that. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Mayer.
Thank you all for coming. What Marcus has implied is that some of my parts are not genuine or original. Actually, back when I was 17 years old, turned up with a very painful right knee, which was diagnosed eventually as a slowly growing tumor. They tried to excavate it, but it was demonstrated to be persistent enough so that after the initial surgery it had recurred. And so they went ahead and did an above-knee amputation back in 1955. So I've seen an evolution of external prostheses as well. The prosthetic device that I'm using here is pretty fancy. That's a computer which detects what I'm doing, and built into this part of it is a set of metal discs that overlap with each other. And they're immersed in what they call a rheological, R-H-E-O, rheological fluid that's liquid filled with iron filings. And what the computer does is it modifies its behavior based on my activity. It monitors what I'm doing and changes the flexibility of the knee in bending and straightening, depending on whether I'm about to fall down, or whether I want to go downstairs, or whether I want to sit down, or whether I want to kick the foot up to clear an object. And the computer basically sends a magnetic field through this set of discs and the rheological fluid, and by virtue of the iron filings, can profoundly affect whether or not the knee will bend freely under load. The other knee wore out because I wasn't very discreet in what I decided to do after this one went away. And so by the time I was 60 or so, this knee was so badly worn that I convinced one of my colleagues to actually put in a knee replacement, which I'll show you, not directly, but which I'll show you an example of later in the program. I think I made him almost terminally anxious by asking him to do that for me, but he got through it, and the knee is still functioning just fine after 12 years. So I'll talk a little bit about the new technology and the expectations that you might have for what we're doing now. But I thought it would be worthwhile to start with a review of what happens that might make joint replacement necessary and appropriate. The hip joint was one of the first joints in the body to be approached by joint replacement procedures. And it's surfaced by this remarkable glistening layer of cartilage. So what it is about the cartilage that makes it so special? The engineering colleagues that have looked at this have demonstrated that this layer, which is largely water, some 60 or 70% water or liquid, accompanied by protein and then an elegant array of fibers. The fibers are densely attached to the bone, go up through the surface, to the surface from the bone, arc over and go back down. They're densely enough arrayed so that when you put pressure on this part of the surface by articulating across the joint, when you put pressure on that cartilage surface, you squeeze it, but the liquid inside is constrained. It can't go down through the bone because that's impervious. And it can't readily go sideways because of the way the fibers are arrayed. So pressure applied to this surface results in a remarkable response called boosted lubrication. Rather than flowing anywhere else, the fluid contained in this matrix is actually constrained to flow out onto the surface and spread. So the two surfaces never touch each other.
Wow.
The result is that cartilage has friction levels lower than your ice skate on Ocker Pond. And it's a better, lower friction surface than most of the engineered surfaces we've been able to conceive of. That's great, but what happens when change occurs? Injuries, diseases, a large array of influences can change the architecture of that cartilage. You can begin to imagine quite readily what's going to happen to that boosted lubrication as soon as this sort of thing starts to go on. It starts on the surface, but it's not restricted to that. Eventually, little chunks come off. One of the interesting things that relates to this is that these little chunks come from a cartilage mass that has no nerve supply and no blood flow. So as you grow up, this cartilage mass has never been exposed to your immune system. So your immune system has never seen it. So it doesn't know that it belongs to you. When these little chunks come off, they're taken up by the lining of the joint. There's lots of blood flow there. And the immune system suddenly is introduced to this stuff and concludes, logically, that it doesn't belong to you. So the joint then is going to trigger a response, which is an inflammation. And unfortunately, the inflammation is not precisely designed to be a benefit. What happens instead is that a soup of inflammatory liquid further degrades the integrity of that marvelous composite structure of fiber and protein cushion. And things continue to go downhill to the point where it starts to look like that. And it's at that point that people begin to say, I don't think I can put up with this anymore. And not only is the cartilage gone, so the friction now between these two surfaces is extremely high, high enough to cause sufficient heat to be painful. And there are lots of nerve fibers in the bone. You are going to know that this has happened. So you start to look more and more unhappy. The pain begins to become more and more pronounced and starts to spread in different places, sometimes almost all the way down to your knee. If that's happening to your knee, then you might start to look like this poor woman. But a very similar process has happened to the cartilage that covers her knee and her kneecap. So in the face of that kind of thing, efforts began quite a long time ago to try to figure out what to do to take care of that. This is an illustration of a hip replacement devised by a British surgeon named Sir John Charmin. And he is Sir John because of what he did in relationship to the development of this technique. He not only developed the design itself, the ball and socket, but the means of fixing it. So he was the one who introduced bone cement, which is an engineered polymer that is what they call cold curing. So you open up a little mixing bowl, you pour in a batch of powder, you pour in a vial of liquid. The powder is methyl methacrylate polymerized. The liquid is monomeric methyl methacrylate. And when they mix together, the powdered form stimulates the liquid form to solidify. And it'll do that at room temperature. So your body doesn't have to be put in a furnace and heated to over 100 degrees in order to get it to set. And it did transform the experience of people with hip trouble who had previously had devices not exactly like this, but with a ball on the top that was stuffed into the marrow, but any size fits everybody. So it worked better than nothing, but not a lot. And so Mr. Charmin, because most of the British surgeons were referred to as Mr. Charmin introduced a bone cement from a dental colleague of his who was using it to make the gum parts of false teeth. And because he'd had experience in the mouth with tolerance for contact with tissue, he recommended it to Sir John, and Sir John grabbed the jar of material from his dental colleague and rushed straight to the operating room to start to put it to work. Turns out that it was much easier for Sir John to do that experimental surgery on people than it would have been in England for him to do it with dogs. And it worked well enough, except for one thing. He decided that what he needed for this part was a plastic material that was very slippery in the lab. So he chose to make his plastic socket out of polytetrafluoroethylene, or Teflon, which is very slippery, and it's also pretty tough. So it's a pretty durable material, and it looked like a good thing when he started to use it. The problem was that when you put a ball into that kind of socket and let it run under the kind of forces that exist through the hip joint when you're walking, anybody have an idea how much pressure there might be in that joint? When you're standing on one foot? Taking a step and then moving forward on that leg puts pressure through that joint of 2.5 to 3 times the body weight that you're carrying. How come? How can that be? Where does that come from? It comes from the muscles that have to contract around the joint to steady you on that one leg. So you're asking a lot of that material in a very constrained space, and you will produce little bits of worn off plastic. What Mr. Charmin discovered within 2 or 3 years of putting in his first one was that when you rub off Teflon and let it get into the tissues respond to that with an exuberant reaction, which Sir John unfortunately was forced to compare to a tuberculosis infection in the hip. Every one of the 350 Teflon hips that he put in had to be taken out. So we moved away from that quite briskly, and we're now still using a plastic material in most hips, which is made of polyethylene, which is a material that's been around for a long time and has been matured and studied and modified to the point where it has a gigantic molecular weight and is extremely resistant to mechanical damage. So that brief misstep Didn't last very long. And so contemporary hips now look more like this. And this is a porous surface, metal device, which is covered usually with tiny little beads of similar metal. And my colleague John Charmin was a principal individual involved in developing that technology to be capable of withstanding the forces, coating both this part here and this part there. That's the lid that sort of surrounds the plastic socket, and then this is the part of the femur that goes down inside the bone. That porous metal, when you choose the right metal and the right geometry for the pores, will encourage blood vessels to grow into those spaces, followed by the development of mature bone, which will then solidify and get a very substantial living mechanical bond between the bone and the implanted metal part. The technology of the plastic has been of great interest to us. We started looking at the porous surfaces. So we were embedding these porous devices that came out of people and putting them through a process that enabled us to make very thin specimens that we could shine light through so we could look at them under the microscope. And relatively quickly we established that the tissue that we were looking at in these areas where living cells were accommodating that porosity were actually looking very healthy and looked like a technology that would do just fine. At the same time, we began to notice that the plastic that we were getting back didn't look so good. And so we began to look more specifically for why it was that the plastic wasn't doing as well as it should have. At about the time we began to realize exactly what needed to happen to make the plastic work better, technology began to re-emerge as an alternative to plastic in the hip. So this is a hip joint which is designed either on a stem to go down inside the bone marrow of the femur with a metal surface that rubs against another metal surface, a metal-on-metal hip. That was tested in the laboratory under very carefully controlled conditions, and it was found to run very smoothly with relatively low friction, not as low as against plastic, but relatively low friction with relatively low wear. And so that began to emerge as a very attractive to some alternative to the plastic on metal or the ceramic on plastic devices that were being replaced when this technology arose. The problem was that the simulations that they did in the laboratory to evaluate the wear responses that those two metal surfaces might make to each other was carefully chosen, and unfortunately did not represent what happens in a person when you put one of these in a living being. People didn't behave the way the machine was programmed to behave. And what happened during that subsequent period of time when this went clinical is that this and that were supposed to be lubricated by a film of fluid that would develop because you're moving. Well, we're not always moving. And so what began to happen was that people would stand still for a while, the fluid film would get squeezed out, and the person would take a step, and instead of sliding in a ball and socket motion, what would happen is that the ball would roll. And as soon as it rolls, it's not contacting over the entire hemisphere, it's now up on the edge. And when you put this ball against that edge, even just a little bit of pressure, body weight or maybe a little more than body weight, makes a dent in the metal. When you push the edge into the metal, you displace some of the metal from the bottom of the dent. That displaced metal ends up next to the dent on the top, sticking up. Now that ridge of sticking up metal goes back inside the socket in the next step, and there's enough friction, and we've calculated that carefully, there's enough friction between those two moving metal surfaces so the metal gets so hot that the ridge that's been created by the dent welds itself to the inside surface of the socket. How good an idea is that? And what happened in a significant number of people who had these hips put in the early 2000s had runaway wear. This surface and that surface are both made of cobalt chrome molybdenum. It's an alloy that was developed for turbine blades and jet engines. Pretty sturdy stuff. And by itself, as a solid mass, it's very well tolerated and creates almost no reaction in the body. But grind it up into tiny little dust-like particles, and you now start to dissolve more and more of the cobalt, especially, in the body. And it gets into your bloodstream, circulates everywhere, eventually interacts with some other systems in your body, gives you a severe tremor, makes your hearing diminish, your vision turns into a tunnel, your thyroid stops working, and your myocardium goes south on you. So it's not a trivial problem for people who have significant cobalt toxicity. We should have known that from the analysis that we could make of the surfaces rubbing against each other, and we should have known that dissolved cobalt wasn't good for you because the Molson Beer Company tried to use it in their product to keep the head on a beer from disappearing too fast. And people who enjoyed their product to some excess demonstrated classic cobalt poisoning. So some of the engineering adventures that we've explored are not always in the right direction. Let's see if we can get that down. In the knee, things have been interesting as well. Not quite as dramatic, but this photograph was taken back just before the FDA established regulations for approving devices for marketplace release. This represents a small proportion of the different kinds of knees you could buy and put in people back in the mid-70s. I think the number was calculated to be somewhere close to 270 different designs. When there are that many different designs, you can bet that many of them are not such a good idea. So evolution has taken its toll, and changes have occurred in the way these knees look, and now they remarkably resemble each other. And most of them look more or less like this. This caps the bottom end of the femur, just above the top of the knee. This goes on the top of the tibia. So it's metal on the top, metal on the bottom, and then plastic in between. The plastic itself was doing very well, and initially was being sterilized by exposing it to a toxic gas which would kill all the germs on the surface. But that was a little bit slower than was desirable, and so people began to explore more efficient and economical ways to sterilize this plastic material. So they exposed it to gamma radiation, which kills not just the germs on the surface, but any germs that might be hiding down inside. Well, there aren't many because of the way it's made. It's much too hot to be a hospital matrix to have germs living inside. But anyway, the gamma radiation would kill all the viruses and all the bacteria that might be resident anywhere in that plastic. When you test the plastic after you've irradiated it, you find that these big, long chain molecules actually now are hanging onto each other. So it resists wear even better than it did before you irradiated it. That's a good idea. We were the only lab around, however, who was looking at this plastic material because it came into our lab along with the porous coated parts that we were looking at. So we were looking at those and we got satisfied that that's working, but what about the plastic that's coming with them? This doesn't look so good. It wasn't supposed to look like that. And we realized that it didn't look like that if it was sterilized with ethylene oxide gas or a gas plasma. It only looked like that if it had been irradiated in the process of sterilization. So we finally figured that out. We presented the data. It wasn't kindly received at first. We were told that if it was as bad as we said it was, we'd have known about it already. So it's not worthy of publication. Well, finally, it became worthy of publication. And within a year and a half or 2 years after we presented that data, the world's industry changed what they did. Everybody sterilized the plastic differently. The interesting thing was that every company changed what they did differently. So now we had a wide array of unique approaches to keeping this germ-free. And in a sense, we had job security because we had to study all of the changes to find out which ones were actually a good idea and which ones perhaps were not. Since that time, the evolution of the plastic management has included a bunch of very sophisticated changes from an engineering and a biochemical point of view. So we can control the tendency for the gamma radiation to stimulate oxidation damage to this plastic, which puts its mechanical properties in the toilet. So we can get this plastic sterilized, we can preserve its mechanical properties, and we have reason to believe that devices like this, with this kind of a combination in the knee and with a plastic in the hip and either a metal or ceramic ball, that these devices can be expected for 95% of the people who have them put in 10 or 20 years later to be still functioning in 95% of those individuals. So it becomes a very viable alternative for suffering with progressively severe joint pain. And it raises some interesting questions for any of you who might be thinking about what to do about a joint that you're not agreeing with. And we can include that in the subsequent conversations that we might want to have about the state of the art.
Great. Thanks, Michael. That was a very informative talk. I'm going to ask a couple of leading questions first, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, and you can get some medical advice, possibly. So in the course of your talk, you discussed so many different fields of science that one has to know when thinking about what we put on the inside of our body.
Right.
So we talked generally about general medical and ND information. Talked about chemistry. You brought in nuclear chemistry in your last slide there. You talked about dental work and chemical sciences. So could you talk a little bit more about your role in collaboration over the last 30 years, 40 years in doing this?
Well, I might even go a little bit farther back to suggest that when Sir John Charmin was sitting in his colleague's dental laboratory, it demonstrated one of the ongoing and very fruitful interactions between dentistry and orthopedics. And there's been a persistent and very beneficial collaborative involvement in those two areas of special endeavor. Both of them putting materials that are being used for devices under extraordinarily serious challenges. When you look at what happens between your jaws when you try to bite down on something, it is not at all dissimilar to what happens in your hip when you step down on that. And so some of the solutions that have come out of orthopedics have emerged as beneficial to dentistry, and some of the dentistry strategies have emerged as very useful interactions for orthopedics. When I got here, I came after an orthopedic residency, which was followed by a year of NIH special postdoctoral fellowship. And that was done at the Case Institute of Engineering in Cleveland. So already I was deeply involved. When I joined the orthopedic training program in Cleveland, one of my mentors was one of the finest biomedical engineers in the world, Al Burstein. And he noticed that I had a Bachelor of Engineering degree. So he said, I'm going to try to get these engineering principles translated into medically definable and digestible terms. Maybe this guy would be a useful ally to get that to happen. So right away, I was sort of at ground zero of getting the interaction between concepts of medical orthopedics and engineering into a form that translated effectively in terms of making orthopedic practice a more effective intervention. When I got here, within 3 weeks, I got a call from a recent graduate of the Thayer School of Engineering. And he called me up and asked to sit down in the conference room and meet with me about his interest in getting involved in research endeavors. So he was interested in looking at implant technologies and implant materials to understand better what happened to them in the body. And I was the resource for him to actually be able to harvest these implants when they came out, so he'd have something to study. If that wasn't sufficiently fruitful, his wife was a faculty member at the medical school in immunology. And so the three of us started mixing it up together. And what she did was she developed a very effective and very accurate assessment of biological reactivity to implanted metal. Because we were beginning to see some patients who were coming back with a broken tibia and a bone plate, and then they developed a rash, and it hurt, and the healing process just wasn't going the way they should. Other patients came in with similar complaints that were not well understood until she began to put her strategies to work and found out that if she drew a blood sample, spun it down so she could separate the cells, take the white cells off that blood sample and put them in a petri dish under very carefully arranged circumstances, that in a normal situation, if you put the cells in these little holes in the petri dish, after 48 to 72 hours, you can actually see some of these cells moving through the agar. They actually are mobile, and they can creep through the protein of the agar and create a little cuff of mobile cells around it. Unless the patient from whom those cells were derived was having an allergic reaction to the metal. So we found out that there was a group of people called non-migrators. We'd take the implant out, test them again, and they were migrating now after a couple of months. If we took those cells and then incubated them in a dilute solution of the metal that they were allergic to, nickel, chromium, not so much titanium, cobalt, the cells would react after being incubated under that exposure, and it would stop migrating. So there's a very clear line between people who didn't mind having that metal dissolved and in their presence and people who did. The most dramatic example was a poor woman who had her gallbladder taken out, and in the process of doing the surgery, they needed to put a clip on an artery that fed the gallbladder, a little stainless steel clip, about that big, tiny little thing. Within a month and a half, she had a total body rash and was itching intolerably. We tested her. She was severely allergic to nickel. They went back in and took the clip out. Her symptoms resolved, and she began behaving normally in terms of the cell migration in the lab. So there are fascinating and unexpected ways that this can accrue. Unfortunately, that initial engineering collaborator got restive and went off to California with his wife. But fortunately, I had already been on the thesis committee of the metallurgist who was being graduated from the Thayer School shortly after after the previous collaborator left. And so we teamed up together and had already developed a way to test the implant materials in the shin of a rabbit. And so we put some porous coatings on the rabbit rods and put them in to examine how the rabbit felt about having a porous metal device in their bone, and that looked great. And we, fortunately, we're in a situation where the FDA had not quite started to clamp down on putting unusual things in people. So we were able to get a small cadre of elderly men and women who'd broken their hips and needed a hip prosthesis, which we found made by a company in Canada, and put that in those few people. Elderly and willing to cooperate and willing to have us examine the part that we put in after they passed away. So we got the first human specimens of porous coated metal, inspired by my engineering collaborator. It was a good idea, and demonstrated from the examination of these thin sections that we developed to look at under the microscope that, in fact, the bone and other tissues that were in close proximity to this porous material, which is a radical departure from the previous geometry of metal put in the body, we're doing just fine. And now that technology is basically standard practice, particularly in the hip.
So that's a lot about sort of internal chemistry and how we react to things. Can we talk a little more about biomechanics?
Sure.
And so you're a user of two types, right, of prosthetic devices, or an implant and a prosthetic device. So what are some things that you've seen in your research or throughout your process of working with folks and putting implants in them that has sort of thrown them off kilter or dramatically changed their
Right.
body if they're sort of
Well,
tackling?
one of the interesting observations is I said that 95% of the people who are having joints put in them now can expect to be doing fine 20 or 30 years later. What about the 5% or more that aren't doing so well? What's going on there? Well, it's a variety of things that could result in a less than ideal outcome. One of them is whether or not you've got diabetes and you ignore an infected toenail. Because any of these implants is vulnerable to having bacteria swishing around in your bloodstream. And that does happen even when you brush your teeth very vigorously or have a tough bowel movement. You can get bacteria very briefly swishing around in your bloodstream and then they disappear. Diabetics have more trouble clearing those bacteria and more trouble dealing with bacteria that start to set up shop in an infected site than the average person would. So some of those 5 or 6 or 7% are people with diabetes and other medical diseases, immune compromised individuals and things of that sort. Some of them are people who sat in the office nodded in agreement when they were advised as to how to behave with a new joint and then somehow forgot all about it. So I would tell people in my practice, you could, but you shouldn't jump off the 3rd rung of a ladder and land on the ground repeatedly every time you climb down. You shouldn't get off your tractor from a great height and land with a crash. You shouldn't drag 70-pound bales of hay up the stairs to the upper part of the barn because there are other ways to get those heavy things where you want them. Nodding and then going off and forgetting everything that I told them. And one of the problems is that these joints are so effective in relieving symptoms that people often forget that they're even there.
Well, New Hampshire farmers are used to doing live free or die.
Maybe both.
Do you think that there'll be a time where we have, or how rapidly is this technology developing to the point where that might not be the case, that you can put new knees in and they're as good as 20-year-olds' knees versus, just sort of replacing?
Well, realistically, the thing that you can't accomplish yet, and we've tried to recreate the cartilage that you started out with when it's healthy because of the boost lubrication, the extraordinary low friction, and of course it's made of living cells which respond constructively to challenge. You put in a material which doesn't do any of those things, and you, by definition, move away from that kind of advantage. There are lots of people with imagination and energy working on approaches that may answer that need, but you're still dealing with a very reactive, very responsive biological system, and trying to sneak things from an artificial source into that system and get away with it without exciting an adversarial response is very, very challenging. And we've demonstrated how difficult it is by the mistakes, some of which I've touched upon during the talk tonight. So there's a sense that exists in the cadre of developers that you've got to move away from materials that have been tried and demonstrated true very conservatively, because you're likely to get burned. And we've been burned often enough to demonstrate the verity of that precaution. So it's not likely that there's going to be some thunderbolt. Why didn't I think of that? That's so obvious, and we should have been doing that all along. I'm not particularly expecting that kind of a dramatic transformation of our strategy. And you're dealing with a situation in which you can't put in a design of any size and shape. It's got to fit in the context of the anatomy that you're trying to fit it into. And then it will be subjected to the loads that I mentioned, which I talked about 2 or 3 times body weight just for walking around. What about playing jungle ball? We know from the studies we've done that ramming and jamming on your hip and your knee create forces inside those joints somewhere closer to 5 and 6 times body weight. So design a device which is structured to deal with that and then make it exactly the right size and shape so that it'll fit where you're going to put it. And you've got a very challenging.
So we talked about knees a lot and hips,
Yep.
and I know shoulders are in there. Is there anything right now that is sort of off limits right now? We not figured out the ankle or
No, almost every joint you can conceive of has been approached with a replacement. Fingers, wrists, elbows, shoulders, ankles, knees, hips, spine, even the facet joints, the little joints on the back of the spine, have been approached with designs that are being promulgated as a possible solution to arthropathy, joint replacement challenges in those anatomical locations. We even got a pair of temporal mandibular joints in the lab a couple of months ago. I'm not sure what the person who had those joints in both sides is doing now, but I shudder to think.
I think this is a great time in our shuttering to open this up to the audience for questions. Oh, we got a question right in the back.
Yes?
I read a few years ago, and it may have had to do with the cobalt molybdenum
Yeah.
hip joints, that I think it was Consumer Reports. And basically, according to Consumer Reports, there was about a $4,000 fee that a manufacturer would pay. Basically, then they could implant anything into a human body. And I don't know if I picked that up completely wrong, or when you said the FDA has cracked down to some extent. I would be interested in your take on that.
Yeah. Basically, the thing that the United States is embarrassed about is that it does not have a joint registry for the implants that are being put in. Unlike forward-thinking countries like Australia, Great Britain, Sweden, and Norway. Those countries log every joint replacement part in terms of what it was and when it was put in and in whom it was placed. And every joint replacement part gets taken out in terms of how long it was put in, how long ago it was put in, and in whom it was put in, and how it was designed. So the United States embarked on this metal-on-metal arthroplasty hip joint replacement strategy, thinking it was solving the plastic debris problem and the wear of plastic by putting in a device which was more resistant to wear. It turned out that the mechanisms for surface damage were not anticipated by the people who did the simulations to see how they would behave when they put the wear process to work in the lab. I'm not sure what you picked up from Consumer Reports. The company that was most responsible in responding to the challenge of having this device go awry on patients offered to cover all of the reoperation expenses for people who had a metal-on-metal hip that failed. And that ran to about $4,000 to $5,000 in terms of hospitalization and operative cost. So that may be where that figure came from. But it's in the United States further complicated by the fact that there are legal allies that you can recruit or who will recruit you when you show up with a problem with a hip implant. And they will suggest that that amount of compensation is miserably inadequate and you certainly deserve much, much more than that for all the pain and suffering that you're going through. So there's been a big kerfuffle in terms of how much of this becomes a matter of in-court litigation and how much of it is handled by making the patient whole in terms of medical care costs. America is a much more complicated venue than some other places around the world because of those factors that are active.
Well, my grandfather had what they all referred to as a wooden leg when I was a kid in the
Right.
40s.
Yeah.
What were they made of then? Were they actually wood?
My first artificial limb back in 1955 was made of willow wood.
Oh, okay.
And it had a knee which was governed by a screw that I could tighten or loosen depending on how much friction I wanted there to be in that joint. So yes, it was a wooden leg back then. What they're doing now is more complicated and esoteric, but it's developing in an even more remarkable fashion, so that what they can begin to do now is to actually have a three-dimensional scan made of the residual limb that you have left, and then using that geometry, input that into a computer, and have the computer print up a socket that accords to the scan geometry of the residual limb that you're modeling for the patient who's had an amputation. So there are developments there that are remarkable. There are also some fascinating efforts to create a much less expensive artificial limb. And one of them is on display in the exhibit that Marcus has upstairs. So that people in third world circumstances can actually get an economically viable solution to limb loss. And those are very exciting efforts that are being made now in the world medical arena.
Well, I have,
Sir?
So I was going to take us back to the underlying cause, the failure of the cartilage. Is anybody looking at stem cell therapy to try and replace damaged cartilage and
Yes.
try to avoid all of these
We
mechanics?
actually did ourselves
Uh-huh.
more than a decade ago. And what we ran into was, yes, you can take a cartilage specimen from some other part of your body, manage it through dissociating or creating stem cell lines that will orient themselves in the direction of creating cartilage. And they will create a matrix of protein and some collagen fibers and enclose or incorporate enough water so that the combination is appropriate to native cartilage. What nobody's been able to do, and we even tried to do it by putting mechanical pressure on the developing cells to try to say, you know, do it this way so that this doesn't bother you. We ended up with mush. So we said, well, damn, I wonder what would happen if we took good cartilage and put it into that machine. And it turned into mush. So the embryo is doing something absolutely remarkable in generating that kind of a architectural composite of fiber and gel and water bonded to bony surfaces that keep it in a structure that will function as a joint that we have not been able to approach, much less achieve. It's a continuing challenge.
I have one of the questions you already have up there, the do it now or wait.
Aha.
Like, why do some people get it young if other people are told, no, you have to wait? And
It's obviously a very personal decision. But my sense, and in talking to patients who were confronted with that in my own practice, my sense was that I would look at the joint that the patient brought in and try to identify its circumstance accurately enough to be able to say, gee, even if it's maybe a 50-50 chance of success in avoiding joint replacement ever, if there's that small or better chance of avoiding joint replacement, let's do that. Let's do the best we can in this direction to try to keep your joint from going all the way down to where you have to have it replaced. Some joints I would look at and I'd say, I'm sorry, that joint is beyond repair. It is bound for joint replacement, and you should know that. And you should begin to put that recognition to work in your effort to make a decision about when you want to have it done. Delay on a joint that looks like it's already destined to go to replacement means you're losing range of motion, flexibility is diminishing, muscle strength is going, and it's going pretty quickly because there are mechanisms in your body which will prevent you from contracting those muscles forcefully around a joint that's unhappy. So you lose muscle strength. The longer you wait to have a joint in that circumstance replaced, the more you lose range of motion and the more you lose muscle strength, and the longer it's going to take to build yourself back up to the best convalescent state that you can after the surgery has been done and successful. So I try to make it clear that that's the situation that you're up against, even for someone in a very young age group. I think the youngest hip replacement patient that I treated back in the mid-70s was 17 years old. Now she was unusual because she had a condition called juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. So she was a tiny little person. She was very slight. So she didn't put a lot of body weight force on the joint that I put in. And that was not the only joint that was challenging for her. So she wasn't going to go run marathons or do other things like that. And she was followed up by a colleague of mine 5 years ago and was still doing well with that same hip.
Guys, a question, since you talked about how our jaws and our knees can all be hooked together, if there's an issue in waiting to have something replaced, and I'm sure millions of people in the world can't have replacement surgery.
Yep.
What else is happening to your body? So you talk most very specifically about what's happening to the specific joint and muscles and tendons around it, but what else would happen to the rest of your body, since you mentioned it all being connected, and maybe also psychologically what happens to you if you're going through years of pain?
Yeah.
What have you seen in your field in terms of?
Well, again, it's a remarkably individual kind of a process, but a single joint like the knee, when it begins to fail, requires, if you're going to try to keep the level of activity that you're committed to going, you're going to ask the joints that are backing that knee up, the other knee, the hip on that same side, the ankle, your spine, all those things that are active mechanically in physically demanding process begin to have to carry new burdens. And in a sense, depending on why it was that the joint that went, that may mean that your choice of ancestry was a little bit less than ideal. So you're maybe blessed with cartilage that doesn't have the durability that you'd hoped it would. We know that there are plenty of people in their 90s and 100s whose joints look great and have no signs of abnormality whatsoever and function just fine. And there are others of us who get into trouble. Family members who can identify a whole range of genealogy that, yeah, actually my father and my grandfather and my father's father had the same thing. So there are things that come along with your choice of ancestry that will put you at greater risk of problems that will arise eventually.
A few more questions. All right, back there at the green.
Mayor, alluding to your last question there, custom just for you or off the shelf, with marketing of implant companies these days, what is your feeling of a custom knee just for you or the off the shelf knee?
Right. Well, it gets even more complicated than that, because one of the marketing efforts that was mounted some time ago was the gender knee. And it was identified that women's knees and men's knees are not identical to each other. So maybe you ought to have a gender-specific knee made specifically for women and another range of knees made specifically for men. So that was the sort of opening salvo in terms of maybe you ought to be having a joint made just for you because it would fit so much better. I can remember a period of time when a company was offering a service that would result in a huge semi-trailer coming up and parking outside your hospital. And the patient would be in the operating room and you'd hollow out the upper end of the femur for the hip joint, and you put in a special material which would sort of partially solidify to make a mold at the inside of your bone, and you'd pull it out and send it down to the truck. And in the truck, they'd fire up the machines and they'd grind away the metal from a big block, and they'd make something that exactly matched that model that came out of the patient. Send that back up. Meanwhile, the patient's there on the table, out cold for 35 minutes waiting for this part to get finished and sterilized. Unfortunately, the results of that then were demonstrably worse than the results of the other alternatives, despite the fact that it fit precisely, at least the moment it was first put in. The fit didn't last, and it didn't do any of the things that we wanted it to do. The question then comes up, well, maybe that was a little crude. Maybe we should have done it in a more elegant fashion by doing a CT scan and then developing a model from the image that the CT creates of the inside of your bone. Make it exactly a replacement for what has gone awry. The problem is that you're talking about a medical strategy that is one of the most cost-effective interventions medicine's got, the way it's being done now, which is off the shelf, 7 different sizes. You get in there, the operating room, you get the site prepared, you see how big, small, bent, straight, whatever you need. You whistle at the scrub nurse, she whistles at the circulating nurse grabs the thing off the shelf, opens the package, dumps it on the table, and you put it in. It works. Do it better. How are you going to prove that you're doing it better? You've got to do it in a lot of people. If it only goes awry in a small percentage, anyway, in order to demonstrate a benefit of a different way to do it, you've got to do it for 2,000 people and then follow them. How long? 10 years. You're going to get your money back? No. So it's a non-trivial challenge to try to figure out how to get the marketing guys to come up with an idea that's realistically an improvement over what we're doing already. And it's hard because what we're doing already works awfully well. So it will continue to come up. You'll hear about it. Custom designs, computer printing, joint replacement parts. Ask the person who's promoting that idea how they've demonstrated its advantage over the way it's being done now. And it's going to be hard for that developer to prove it's a move in the right direction.
Okay, one more question, our last question.
Yeah, just a short thing, okay, just to say, I want to tell you my favorite prosthetic joke. Pirate walks into a bar, he has a peg leg, a hook, and a patch over one eye. The bartender says, whoa, he says, you must have quite a history. He says, I'll give you a free beer if you'll tell me how you lost your leg. And the pirate said, oh, I fell overboard and there was shark-infested waters and the shark got my leg. The bartender says, well, I'll give you a second beer if you tell me how you lost your hand. He says, well, we were fighting with enemies with swords and somebody lopped it off. So, okay, I'll give you another beer free if you tell me how you lost your eye. He said, well, a seagull flew over and pooped in it. He said, why would that make you lose your eye? He says, it was the first day with the hook.
Thank you. One last question here. We have one last, ma'am?
I just wanted to, I am a patient. Back in the year 2000, both my knees were replaced by him and a friend of his. And I want to say that what it is a highly individualistic thing. It depends on the patient and the way the patient is and the way the patient actually reacts to the therapy that has to be happened afterwards and the regeneration. So I think you can't really predict what's going to happen until you actually understand the damn patient. And if the patient is a patient and knows how to actually go through the whole process of regeneration, it can be pretty damn good. If the attitude is negative, its personality is negative, it's going to be problems. So the thing is that a patient who wants to have his or her knees replaced had better examine herself and himself first and decide whether they think they're going to go through with the whole thing that is going to actually be post-operative regeneration stuff.
That's the problem with us not being robots and being humans and living creatures. One last question, because you had your hand up there in the back.
I just wondered if you could speak briefly about assistive technologies, something that would give a person more fine motor skill if they, for some reason, didn't have it. Or I know that upstairs there's, I think it was the first slide that you had, which is a prosthetic hand with an implant. Is there anything like that that is more of an assistive thing rather than a replacement?
Well, there are two broad fields in musculoskeletal management: orthotics and prosthetics. Prosthetics are put inside and actually, or on the outside, replace a part that's not there or not working. Orthotics are outside frameworks that are devised to support an existing body part or member. There are a lot of interesting developments which relate to robotics in the defense industry. DARPA is doing some fascinating work on powered orthotics to help military personnel in the field deal with these increasingly burdensome packs that they have to take with them in order to function in the field. And it's an interesting question. Will that result in some real benefit for people that have suffered neurologic abnormalities that need external orthotic support that is also powered in terms of improving their range of function and their capacity to do well without exhausting their energy reserves because they don't have the muscle strength to deal with what they're trying to accomplish. Those are fascinating areas that are being developed. None of them, in my awareness, have entered a clinical reality for patients with stroke or patients with paralytic disease of any kind. One of the major paralytic diseases that might have benefited from that technology disappeared with the Salk vaccine and other immunization strategies that were so effective. Colleagues of mine who are graduated from residency programs just before I entered mine remember serving on polio wards that were filled with hundreds of patients dealing with the various stages of poliomyelitis. And they were in training when the immunization programs began to take effect, and these wards emptied themselves out. People just weren't being affected that way. My sense is that both of those things are going to be important in making quality of life improvements for people in a wide variety of circumstances that are having trouble of lots of different kinds.
I would note that the American Alliance of Museums just put that specific topic in the trends to watch for 2016, which means that many museums are featuring this kind of additive technology or assistive technology, specifically talking about where you are, so military or warehouses or factories where people are starting to use exoskeletons to help lift much heavier equipment. We have a very small example in a picture in that exhibition of that happening, but the intersection of how that's reacting with the interior of our bodies is right now sort of at the forefront of people thinking about how do we implant things into our bodies that might have alternative uses than just a hip or a knee. So people are starting to put all manners of implants inside of themselves, testing out microchips, magnets, LED lights, anything in sort of a new body hacker mentality of like how do we start thinking about what we put into our bodies in our new sort of digital and technological age where we put tracking mechanisms in our cats, for example, or our dogs. Well, you can put that in yourself too, and you can release or not release that information to whoever you choose. So there's a whole community of these sort of new implants that's springing up and being featured radically in a lot of art and science museums all throughout the country. So with that, I want to thank Dr. Michael Mayer so much for imparting all this. I know that he did bring some things that were in people at some point, but are now on that table back there. So if you'd like to take a look at some implants that are there, we also have a small example of that from our own exhibition that we brought down here. Next week, we'll be taking a look at a different side of adaptive technologies with Maggie Burke from Vermont Adaptive Ski and Sport. We'll be talking about what are the different types of adaptations that we might need to use when we bring people who have special needs or difficulties out into the world to do things that we take for granted every day, like skiing or snowshoeing. So she'll be bringing a massive assortment of really great adaptive technologies and showcasing them and talking to us about communities of practice around accessibility. So with that, have a wonderful evening, everybody. We'll be here for a few more minutes. You can take a look and maybe talk with